Thank you very much. Indeed, the immediate office of the prosecutor is very much in the close proximity of the prosecutor. I've heard us described as sort of the outside communications with the outside world office, but there's in fact a whole lot of work that gets done, including policy-related, indeed communications with external providers of all kinds of interesting documents and information, also communicating with the victim community, etc. But enough about me, although I will say that I originally come from the former Yugoslavia as well. I grew up in Sarajevo, Croatian by ethnicity, but was fortunate enough to leave Sarajevo before the war started, and as a result grew up and was educated in the United States of America. As a young teenager and as a college student, knowing what was happening back in my country was immensely, well, frustrating. There were also some feelings of guilt, bizarrely, about not being there, not sharing in the suffering. And the only things as a kid that I could do was translate for some of the refugees that were coming to the various states that I lived in over the years, try to raise money for orphanages where kids who were left without parents were, and so on. But I kept trying to look for a way to actually, more concretely contribute. And for a while, I studied biology and thought I would maybe join the Médecins Sans Frontières. Of course, by the time I would complete those studies, the conflict was bound to be over, and in fact it was. But somewhere along the way, I discovered international humanitarian law and thought this might be something to do. So I studied it, graduated in it, worked for a few years as a corporate lawyer in New York, and then got the call from the ICTY that I was actually accepted into the prosecution office. That was tremendous. So I flew in 2005 and was placed on a case called Prosecutor Popovic et al., which at the time I joined in pre-trial was a case against 9 accused. But as things happened, one of the accused was a fugitive at the time that the case started, and ultimately a separate case against him was held. That was the case of Zdravko Tolimir. Another case, or one of the other accused, Milorad Trbic, ended up being transferred to Bosnia and Herzegovina, where there was a separate trial that took place. But it was a case, as many of you will know, in relation to the genocide that took place in Srebrenica, the forcible transfer of tens of thousands of civilians. Now, the question today, the presentations that we are all giving are in relation to the Mladic case. And I was thinking about what is the key, what can be presented succinctly in about 10 minutes, and nothing can. But what I will at least try to answer is maybe the question that many of you have, which is, what does it take to build a case against somebody of that stature, somebody who's such a high-level official, and why do trials last so long? And I'm sure many of you already have the understandings. In order to bring in front of the international judges a case of this size, as you heard Judge Alphonse Ori, who is a Dutch judge and presiding judge of the Mladic trial, we're not talking about one single crime. We're not talking about 100 of individual crimes. We're talking about thousands of individual crimes that took place. We're talking about an overarching joint criminal enterprise, of which we have alleged Ratko Mladić as the commander of the main staff of the Army of Republika Srpska, the VRS, as I'll refer to it if I mention it a couple more times. We are talking about so this overarching criminal enterprise to basically ethnically cleanse the area of Bosnia-Herzegovina and cleanse it of Bosnian Muslims and Bosnian Croats. We're talking then about individual subsuming criminal enterprises in relation to Sarajevo, for example, the terrorizing of the Sarajevo population through sniping and shelling. We're talking, of course, about the Srebrenica genocide, which especially, I think, in the Netherlands tends to be very, very relevant because of the Dutch battalion that was present there at the time when the offense occurred. And then finally, we're talking about a slightly lesser known, but nevertheless relevant joint criminal enterprise, and this was in relation to the hostage-taking of the international peacekeepers in May of 1995, so actually prior to the Srebrenica genocide. Now, as Dov had mentioned, July 1995 was when the first indictment against Ratko Mladić was issued. That was the very first indictment, and it was in July 1995. Now, many of you will know, July 1995 is also the time when the Srebrenica genocide was taking place. except, of course, we hadn't yet identified it as such, although we did have an investigator and a few translators on the ground in Tuzla very shortly thereafter. So in November of 1995, a new indictment was issued, and that indictment subsumed inside it charges in relation to the Srebrenica genocide. But nothing was static. At that time in 1995, there wasn't clear and immediate access to a lot of the areas where, for example, the mass graves were located, right? So all we could do initially at that very first instance, as the conflict had actually was still going on until the Dayton Peace Accords, was speak to the victims, speak to those who were survivors of the individual massacres or execution sites, speak to the survivors, learn about the separation of the women and the children and the elderly from the men, who were then never to be seen again. And this investigation continued on, and in fact, in a way, continues up to this very day. Because at the time when we actually had one of the very first trials in relation to Srebrenica, and that was the trial of Dražen Erdemović, a small level, a very low level shooter who had shot, at least by his own admission, over 100 Bosnian Muslim prisoners at the Branjeva farm execution site. He pled guilty for these crimes. At that time, we only had anthropological evidence, so actually the individual bones and maybe some identifying materials, occasionally a few pieces of IDs that still had survived. But as we initially didn't have immediate access to the actual grave sites, it took a while, and it was only really in 2000, and as the cases of Krstić and then Blagojević and Obrenović and others started developing, that through the work of the ICMP, the International Commission for Missing Persons, we were also starting to get DNA identification. And so whereas before we had evidence, anthropologically speaking, we now, as of this date, as of the date that we're presenting our evidence to the court in the Mladic case, have almost 6,000 actual identifications. And this means identifications not only from those primary graves, which again, in the beginning, that's all we knew about, but later on also the reassociations from the secondary and even tertiary graves in which the bodies had been hidden in an attempt to hide this massive crime. And this is just Srebrenica, right? So we are speaking to witnesses, and the kinds of witnesses we're speaking to are not only victim witnesses, survivors witnesses, we're also starting to get a bit of an idea as to how the structure works. The structure of the perpetrators, the structure of the VRS, the structure of the Ministry of Interior that was cooperating. And we're trying and starting to build together a picture of how this process worked. You know, how do you, just for Srebrenica now, and I'm not even talking about the others, how do you manage to do something so massive within such a short period of time? How do you displace 30 to 40,000 civilians within basically a space of 3 days? How do you murder over 7,000 men and boys within a space of just over a week? It takes some organization, it takes some planning, but initially, especially in 1995 and 1996, the ICTY hadn't really had so much credibility yet, and so it didn't really have access to things such as military archives. So we didn't actually have the type of clear evidence that would allow us to see how the chain of command worked, who was who in that chain of command, to understand better how the unity of command worked, to understand who the actual infantry units and battalions were that were in the various places where the various massacres were occurring. But that picture started slowly but surely building over time, and we did get access to those archives, which was priceless. We also got access to things such as intercepts. Many of you may have heard about those, right? That's counterintelligence information. Each army spies on the other, tries to hear, information that might be useful in an attack or in defense. And all of these things together with starting to speak to suspects, starting to speak to those who may have been a part of these operations, help you build a picture. But it's nothing that you can do within a space of a week, months. It really does take years just to gather this evidence. And then when you're talking about forensic evidence, mass graves evidence, you need to also speak to experts. You actually need the experts to properly exhume this information. You need to have proper classification of all the information, all the artifacts, every bone that's coming from the graves, to understand the meaning of this, to be able to properly analyze it and understand whether it's a case of just clearing up the terrain, as has been claimed by defense in every single one of the Srebrenica cases that we've dealt with so far, or whether we're actually dealing with men who are lined up and simply shot illegally. So there's this. So we're speaking to experts. We've got victims. We've got suspects. We're also dealing with all kinds of different types of evidence. And again, I've mentioned some, but there's audiovisual, not just documents that are coming from armies themselves. There's also, documentaries that are being created at that moment. And again, many of you will have seen the iconic moment when Mladic walks through Srebrenica town and says, "The time has come for us to take revenge upon the Dahi," which is a derogatory term for the Turks, and another derogatory term for Bosnian Muslims that was often used. So all of this together has taken a while to build up. And even while I was still working on the Popovic case, there was a new gravesite, the Bishina gravesite, which had no survivors in it, but that we discovered because of a combination of intercept information, intercept materials, and knowledge of the movements of one of the accused. And ultimately, this evidence was allowed to enter into that case, though only as evidence of pattern, not actually to be directly used in the sentence against the accused. So this is just Srebrenica we're talking about. But as I've just told you, we're also talking about the massive overarching case that's taking place in terms of ethnic cleansing. We're talking about the massive amounts of evidence in terms of the Sarajevo sniping and shelling, as well as the evidence about what's happening in the various municipalities. This takes time to gather. And then when you gather it, the man is a fugitive still, and you continue gathering it. But as Dov said, in 2011, he finally arrives in the courtroom. And he was in very bad state, as you saw there. He was really not looking good. And at one point in time, a few months into his stay at Scheveningen prison, he actually thanked the court and everybody for the treatment, the health treatment that he had been getting, because he believed that otherwise he would have been at St. Peter's gates had he not gotten that treatment. He has been a lively defendant. There have been moments when he has been thrown out of the room by Judge Ori. There have been outbursts. There is something, it's not quite helped by the structure. For those of you who may have visited the tribunal, he sits back in the dock and then his defense lawyers sit in front. And sometimes he literally has to raise his voice in order to reach out to them and to tell them to object or respond to a point. So I wouldn't completely blame him for the fact that he raises his voice on occasion. And it's a trial that's been going on for 4.5 years. In terms of the numbers of exhibits, I can say that from the prosecution side, over 7,000 pieces of evidence have been admitted. Altogether, 377 witnesses have appeared, of those 169 prosecution witnesses. And I cannot actually begin to say how many thousands of pages of transcript we have. And every single one of you can access this information at the ICTY website. You can click on the Mladic case, and you can get this information, and you can actually read the transcript if you so choose to do, though it would take a while. So what happened then was, after the case the case is about to be finished. At the beginning of November, both sides, so the Mladic defense as well as the OTP prosecution, filed their final briefs. They are about 700-page affairs each, currently confidential, but eventually also will be available to the public. And again, one of the things that I meant to also mention, in the gathering of all of this evidence, what is the point ultimately? Yes, it is to prove beyond a reasonable doubt whether this individual, Ratko Mladić, is criminally responsible for the grave violations of IHL, international humanitarian law, that took place on the territory of the former Yugoslavia since 1991. And I am on my way towards concluding. And in the process of gathering all this evidence, there are things, basically, I'm talking about the crimes, and that I've already talked about. So we're talking about what crimes took place. Just gathering that takes a lot of time and effort. Then the second level that you have to look at, does this actually rise to the level of international crimes? Is it a crime against humanity, a war crime? Is it a genocide? And finally, it's this linkage evidence that's very important and in many ways the most difficult to get, about crimes the world knows. We've read about it. You can read the Commission of Expert reports. But ultimately, it really is this fine details that you're often going to only be getting from the insider witnesses, the suspect witnesses, about the linkage of this one individual that we are accusing, that we are charging with individual criminal responsibility for these various criminal acts. So I want you to keep in mind the architecture of a typical international criminal law case. And I think I will conclude now. In fact, my call to you would be not that you all become prosecutors, because I don't think that too many prosecutors I don't think is a good idea. I think we also do need balance, and we do need some defense lawyers as well in order to keep the due process going. And in fact, yes, many of you should become defense attorneys as well. Also, go and become chambers, but you don't have to be lawyers, I think, to be a part of this process. You know, to those of us who come from countries that have fallen apart, who come from war-torn countries currently, I think the important thing also is being able to talk about this. It's also important for us to be able to look at information, to analyze information, not to make assumptions. A very big reason for me going into this work was to also, just for my own self, find out what happened, be able to try to make some sense. And while I cannot say that it still makes full sense, at least I understand a whole lot of the workings behind it. I'm understanding through the evidence that I have read, that I have led, that I have proofed witnesses on and examined witnesses on missions. I'm starting to understand that narrative overall. And that's important. And again, not all of you will be doing it through investigations, not all of you will be doing it through prosecutions or any kind of legal work. But I think it's crucial. It has always been crucial, but I think in this day and age, with such a prevalence of all kinds of media, to try and keep ourselves informed, to also go outside of the bubbles that we may be prone to stay inside, to not just read just the newspapers that we usually read. If we're on the left, this kind of newspaper. If we're on the right politically, that kind of newspaper. But to really stretch, to also to give the other side a chance, and to try to construct a whole narrative out of that. So I thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to hearing your questions.